Tonight, on our century, that lusty spirit of adventure that makes some of us do things that sensible people would never do. From climbing Mount Everest without oxygen.
Snow and ice just kept pouring down on top of me.
To those madcap moments when you just have to have a lash.
For the first time in the world, our car can leave the house.
If you have to ask why they took such risks, well, you'll probably never understand. Risking life and limb, I guess, is part of growing up. And the more dangerous, the better it is. In Australia, we seem to hang on to that spirit a little longer, a sort of have a go. Maybe it's because the countryside physically is so tough, or because we see ourselves as a pioneering bunch. For most of us, though, it's nothing more than going in the surf when it gets a bit rough, or maybe a four-wheel drive around Australia. But for others, the larrikins, it's much more than that. Call it daring or damn stupid, but you just got to shake your head and wonder at some things some Aussies have done.
Can Campbell clear it? Now they're closing in onto that berg. Heaven! Yes, bravo, they're off!
Back in 1930, when Don Bradman started breaking test records, Australian explorer Sir Douglas Mawson headed for the bottom of the world to map the coast of Antarctica. Now, it doesn't get much more daring than this.
Now we're heading out over the pack-strewn ocean. We can accomplish in an hour what the Discovery would take 24 hours to do.
The Antarctic was empty and hostile, but it was also unknown. And that's exactly what drives the spirit of adventure. For all its bleak beauty, the Antarctic can be a deadly place.
The Douglas Mawson is standing by on the fuselage, ready to hook on. And just as the machine is being lifted, one of the strops is carried away, and the machine is being hurled against the ship's side. The airmen are flung out. The Douglas is in peril of the whole lot crashing down upon him.
Had Douglas Mawson dropped, he would almost certainly have died. But he knew the dangers of this wild place. His first expedition had been in 1911. The journey through violent storms and piercing cold was just a taste of what lay ahead. At first, they were clawed by howling winds that made simple jobs impossible. In the year that they were there, the wind speed alone averaged 100 kilometres an hour. When a break in the weather finally came, Mawson decided to explore. And together with fellow travellers Xavier Mertz and Belgrave Ninnis, he headed off across the Great White Continent. 500 kilometres from base, disaster struck. Ninnis and one of the dog teams, along with most of their food, plunged into a crevasse. They were lost forever. Mawson and Mertz turned back, with next to no hope of making it to safety. Mertz died 3 weeks later. Mawson struggled on alone. Every kilometre had to be fought for and won. "54 days of heartache passed. Yet against all odds, Mawson staggered back to base, more dead than alive. In one of the great near misses of Antarctic adventuring, he was just in time to watch his supply ship sail for Australia. Frank Hurley, who shot this remarkable film, remembers what happened next.
5 members were left behind to search for Dr. Mawson. and they had to remain a whole year in the Antarctic until the relief ship could return through the pack ice and pick them up.
But the Mawson expedition was more than just heroics and adventure. Because of them, Australia now claims and protects 1/3 of Antarctica, the world's last great unspoiled wonderland.
The compass is just swinging around lazily. It's at least 30 degrees out. I'm just going to be using the sun and using true north because...
If your name's Smith and you're Australian and you fly, well, off you go. Off into the unknown. Kingsford Smith, Ross Smith, and of course Dick Smith, they all did it.
I find that the spirit of adventure is incredibly important to me. It's the challenge, it's the adrenaline pumping of being able to take a risk and hoping that you're going to be able to get away with it.
There was nowhere that Dick Smith and his trusty helicopter couldn't go. In 1982, he was the first to fly a helicopter around the world. 5 years later, he packed his chopper up, sent it to Canada, and then headed off for the North Pole. Again, off into the unknown. But it's scary stuff, as distant and as dangerous as the moon. Rotten weather stopped him twice.
Cold, very cold. I hardly talk, it's so cold. Oh.
But he had another go, and he made it.
Look at that. 79 west, 90 degrees north. I'm right over the North Pole.
There's nothing shy and retiring about Dick Smith. Doing things with gusto and mad enthusiasm has become his trademark.
Well, I'm down right at the North Pole. Incredible. But talk about exciting. I'm right on the top of the world. Every way is south. Sydney is down that way. It's about 7:15 on Wednesday morning. Here it's 4:15 on Tuesday afternoon. Cairo's down that way. It's midnight. India. Oh, New Zealand back down there. Every way is south, and I'm right on the top of the world. I'm going to do the quickest journey ever around the world. Look at that. Wednesday, Tuesday. Right around the world. Fantastic.
This part of our century, anything to do with flying and planes meant adventure. Across this wide brown land of ours, this would be the way of the future, the way to go. Flimsy contraptions made of paper and fence wire were soon bouncing across the back paddocks of Australia. But you had to be tough. It was a world of open cockpits, where flyers froze in the wind and the rain. And who cared about parachutes? In fact, flyboys bragged that a good landing was one that you walked away from. Still, everyone wanted to feel what it was like to fly. Pilots paid their way by giving joyrides to anyone silly enough to fork out a week's wages for a few minutes up and away. In the early days, one of these tickets to ride read Nancy Bird. At the tender age of 19, she was the youngest flyer in the British Empire. Nancy paid her way by barnstorming at country shows, giving joyrides at 10 bob a time. Later, the newsreels tagged her the Angel of the Outback, because in between winning national air races, Nancy Bird carved out a reputation flying medical care to remote families. Yet it all began as a bit of an adventure. Working in a father's country store, she decided to have a go at flying lessons. And that's what you did back then. And how about this mad bloke? In 1910, John Digan was a sheep farmer from Maya in Victoria. He'd never even seen a plane, but he decided to build one from pictures in a magazine. And nobody was more surprised than young John when the thing actually flew.
Kingsford Smith, Aussie is proud of you, proud it's true.
Australia in the 1920s and in the 30s was a time for heroes, and nobody was more idolised than Smithy.
Kingsford Smith.
In 1928, thousands poured onto a glorified paddock called Brisbane Airport to welcome home Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm. They were the first to fly from California to Australia. 6,000 miles across the biggest, loneliest ocean in the world. They only flew together for 2 years, yet Smithy and Ulm smashed 6 long-distance records, and they became living legends. Smithy seized the public imagination as we fell into the gloom of the Great Depression.
I think that I can safely prophesy with the more modern flying equipment that is...
The King of England gave him a knighthood.
That mails and even passengers will be definitely transported between England and Australia in the amazing time of 1 week.
To Australians, he wasn't Sir Charles, he was always Smithy. In the 1940s, the great director Ken Hall made a movie about Smithy. This film would recreate one of the most daring, true stories of his adventurous life.
Smithy makes it again, this time facing the heaviest odds that have been against him.
In 1933, Australia held its breath when Smithy and his crew somehow made it home.
As the old plane limps down, the useless engine on the left can be seen, a dead weight, one that nearly carried a gallant crew to their doom.
They were halfway to New Zealand, 1,000 kilometres from Sydney, when one of their engines went kaput.
Now the crowd had claimed the living, boys who faced death, and yet won out.
Remarkably, when they made the movie, Smithy's co-pilot Bill Taylor and his radio operator John Stannard turned up, and they recreated their roles in one of the death-defying dramas of early flying.
Stand by, please. What?
Having lost one of its engines, the Southern Cross was still able to fly on the remaining 2. But the extra strain eventually burned up the oil in the engine on the other wing.
Gotta have a stab at getting some oil.
So while Smithy steadied the plane, his co-pilot Bill Taylor did something truly amazing. He climbed out onto the wing strut. Then he drained the desperately needed oil from the dead engine into a thermos flask. And he passed that to the radio operator, who poured it into a leather suitcase.
He's done it. He's got the oil. If ever a man deserved the Victoria Cross, that man is Bill Taylor.
Taylor then climbed out onto the other wing, and he tipped the oil into the other motor.
Bill! Hold on! We gotta go up!
Taylor's extraordinary courage and Smithy's skill as a pilot saved the day. But the time for risk-taking was fast running out. Charles Ulm, his longtime friend and fellow flyer, was lost in the Pacific in 1934. Less than a year later, Smithy disappeared as well.
Earlier, he'd taken delivery of a new plane, the Lady Southern Cross, with which it was hoped to regain, among others, the England-Australia record. He was to tempt fate for the last time. They were lost over the Bay of Bengal, closing the career of Australia's greatest aviator.
Think of some harebrained, high-risk stunt that involves flying through the air, or crashing, or blowing yourself up. And some crazy, daredevil Aussie bloke will have a go at it.
Harry Woolman, ace of them all, reckons they were child's play. And in this stunt, filmed exclusively by Cine Sound, he shows for the first time in the world how a car can leap a house.
But as we began our century, the stunts that turned us on were more often tests of endurance. In those days, travelling through the empty interior of Australia was a bit like travelling across the galaxy. Much of it hadn't been explored, apart from Aboriginal tribes and the occasional supply team. This bloke, Francis Birtles, liked a challenge. So in 1907, he loaded up his push bike with a Winchester rifle, 200 bullets and 130 kilograms of tucker, and he set out across the Nullarbor. It's no wonder that people said goodbye to Francis. But incredibly, 21 days and 3,000 Ks later, man and machine rolled into Melbourne. None the worse for wear. And Francis Birtles didn't stop there. Over the next 30 years, he just about wore a track across Australia. An incredible 80 times he went back and forth by bike or car. Of course, being the world's biggest island, the sea has also been a favourite playing field for Australia's homegrown adventurers.
With 6 months of sailing the world's loneliest seas behind her, Kay Cotty entered Sydney Harbour and the record books early this afternoon.
In our bicentennial year, 1988, it was Hello Sailor as Kay Cotty came home, triumphant as the first woman to sail solo around the world. After nearly 6 months on deck, she certainly had a sea legs, but the feel of terra firma would take some getting used to. Still, for Kay Cotty, like all those other Aussie adventurers, it was a small price to pay. She took on the world and she won. Sometimes the spirit of adventure means jumping off something or diving down. Other times, the only way is up. In 1984, Australian climber Tim McCartney-Snape and 4 others took on Mount Everest, all the way to the top of the world. It was always going to be dangerous. Why else would you do it?
It lasted for ages and ages. Just snow and ice just kept pouring down on top of me.
Of course, Mount Everest had been conquered before, many times. But what made this epic climb different and more dangerous was that they were attempting it without oxygen. In the wafer-thin atmosphere, every step became a gasp for breath.
The constant thought is, this is impossible. This is just too hard. But you keep going, and you just count 4 or 5 steps ahead, and then you stop, and you think about the next 4 or 5 steps.
They did eventually make it. On a clear day, if you shut your eyes and hummed Waltzing Matilda, you could see all the way to Australia. In spite of our sun, surf and sand culture, Australians were world pioneers in snow sports. Way back in 1861, a group of gold miners in Kiandra, up in the Snowy, held the first ski race, using fence palings as skis. 9 years later, Kiandra became home to the world's first ski club. This was 2 decades before the Swiss. But it wasn't much good having the first ski club unless you could get yourself to the snow. It wasn't until the 1920s that cars and buses could handle the icy roads. That's when snow sports began to take off, for some lucky Aussies. And even when you got yourself to the Alps, there were no ski lifts. It was a hard slog to the top of the hill. Some things never change. Back then, just as it is today, falling on your bum in the snow was often the best adventure of all. The fact is that over the years we've had dozens and dozens of ordinary Australian men and women who've done extraordinary things. It used to amaze me in travelling around the world that you'd get to the most remote part of Afghanistan or Alaska or anywhere, and suddenly you'd come across an Aussie having a go, scaling a mountain or jumping out of planes or launching themselves off cliffs like this one for some reason. It seems that taking risks is almost in our blood.
If you've enjoyed our century, be sure to get a copy of the soundtrack CDs featuring music from the series, available at all good record stores.